Today is May 14th, 2014. My name is Martin Do Nascimento, and I'm interviewing Professor Paula Poindexter for the AEJMC Diversity Oral History Project, Oral History Interview Project. Thank you, Dr. Poindexter, for agreeing to do this interview. And please know that it will be housed at the AEJMC Archives and at the Briscoe Center for American History here at UT in Austin. And that the interview will also be posted on the internet.
Okay.
Really, thank you again for sitting down with us. Let's swivel this a little bit further this way. So the kind of general order of the questions is kind of talking about how you came to be interested in journalism. And then from there, talk about your work in the academy and practicing journalism. And then kind of the role that the AEJMC has played in your life, or your reflections on that. And then just kind of current issues, thoughts about questions of diversity in journalism, education specifically, and journalism in general. So the first question is just, how was it that you came to be interested in journalism, if I can ask?
Well, actually, I was thinking about the question, that particular question this morning when I was driving in. How did I come to be interested in journalism? The correct answer is my interest in journalism was accidental. When I graduated from college, I was a radio, TV, film major. In fact, I studied radio, TV, film. So, and journalism was a different department, so I wasn't involved in journalism, wasn't interested in journalism. My goal was to become a television producer and to go out to LA. Well, it so happened that when I graduated, that the first full-time job that I had was as a news reporter and producer. And I had absolutely no experience. But at that particular time, there were very few people of color. There were very few women in the newsroom, and certainly that was the case in Houston, Texas, which is where I had my first TV news job, and that was at KPRC TV, the NBC affiliate in Houston. And I had really no idea what I was doing because of the fact that I had not studied journalism and the principles of journalism, but I certainly knew about, making films. And our program was a daily news and feature program. So I was responsible. There were two producers. I was a co-producer and the other co-producer, and we also had an anchor for the program. And so we were responsible in doing a local news feature in the Houston area. And those were fairly long pieces, 5 to 8 minutes or so, which is unheard of today, unless you're talking about 60 minutes. So I learned a lot about producing features at that time, and then also I would narrate the features. But the bottom line is that I learned, became involved in journalism accidentally. I learned it on the job, and I discovered that it was something that I, of course, was very interested in, but hadn't really thought about, as a field prior to that.
Sure. Can I ask you just to kind of outline what happened next in the story professionally?
Well, actually, what happened next was that I decided that I absolutely did not like doing that. Part of the reason, I think, was because I was also on television. I didn't really like being on television. I really wanted to be behind the scenes. But I started also feeling, because at the time that you were pretty much limited to more feature-oriented, and it seemed not so important, that I decided to go to graduate school. So I did stay there at the TV station for almost 3 years, and I went to graduate school at Syracuse University. My plan, because I was a writer, was very interested in writing. In fact, I wrote for my job every day. But I had decided that I wanted to become a magazine journalist, and I would go to Syracuse, which pretty much was a pipeline into New York City, and to work for a magazine. So that was my plan. But when I went to Syracuse to get my master's, I was introduced to research I had an assistantship or research assistantship in the Communications Research Center and had an opportunity to work under Dr. Maxwell McCombs, who is a very famous international scholar. And he did introduce me to research. We were doing public opinion surveys in various communities around the Northeast and understanding and learning why people were interested in the news, why they, what news they read or they paid attention to, and so forth. And so that was really the first time that I had been exposed to looking at things from the news consumer's perspective, and I absolutely love that. So I stayed at Syracuse University to get I finished my master's, stayed there and got my PhD, and I had opportunities to do research while I was both there and also had job opportunities afterwards. But I went to the University of Georgia and I taught there for a year. Nothing against the University of Georgia, but Athens was pretty isolated, so I didn't enjoy living there, but I had an opportunity to go to the Los Angeles Times. I met the then publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Tom Johnson, who was on the advisory board of the School of Journalism there at University of Georgia, and he said to me if I ever decided to leave Georgia, to give him a call, and I did, and I followed up, and so the Los Angeles Times hired me. So I left Georgia and went to the Los Angeles Times. Now, at the Los Angeles Times, I was on the business side as opposed to in the newsroom, which was really great because I had an opportunity essentially in having worked in the newsroom, at the TV station, and now working on the business side of a major newspaper to really see journalism from both sides. And pretty much for a long time, really until fairly recently, that the business side has been separated, has been kept separate from the newsroom because it was always felt that somehow that journalists might get tainted if they were connected in any way to the money. But the truth is that we all need to understand that this is, it's news, it's journalism, but it's still a business. And if you can't make it succeed, then we're all going to be less for it. So essentially, I had that opportunity to learn about it from the business side, and that was a great experience for me too.
Sure. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
You said from both sides, but I'm thinking from every which side you had
yes.
Kind of exposure
mm-hmm.
from the business, from the newsroom, from studying at an academia.
Mm-hmm.
That's really fascinating. Okay. And I guess we'll pick up kind of the thread of where you went to next in a little bit. But I'm curious, was it while you were studying radio, television, and film? Was it before then? Was it while working as a TV journalist or during your MA program? Was there a moment where you became aware or became more aware of questions of diversity in journalism?
I wouldn't say that there was a moment that I became aware, but what I will say is that as someone who was born and raised in Texas, in a state that was a slave state, in a state that was segregated until after the Civil Rights Movement, someone who works at a university that has a very long history of segregation, and even today does not have a significant number of African Americans attending the university if you compare it to others. So it's always just been an awareness that I've had because of the state that I come from. Did I consciously translate that into consciousness, related to journalism? Not necessarily, but I will say that when I worked for the TV news in Houston, that because Houston is really quite a diverse city, that I did make a point of seeking out diversity in terms of the programs, the stories, the feature stories that I did. But I can't remember that there was one specific moment, but you can't help, and certainly in the time that I grew up and also in the state of Texas, that it's just a part of you. So it's not like, it's just a part of you. What can I say?
Do you remember any of the stories that you covered in Houston?
Well, what I do remember that I had come up with this idea, and which was really separate from my regular daily work, but I had come up with this idea that I wanted to do a documentary on essentially blacks in Houston, and I had called the documentary On the Other Side, and the news director approved it. And so it was an hour-long documentary, which did air, which was really quite unheard of. And I made a conscious effort to really explore Houston and specifically African Americans from more of a cultural point of view, and show some of the art and music. And it was still more of a feature documentary, but I did want to bring that awareness to people, who weren't aware. So I would say that probably more than anything. The other thing that I did, because at the time, one of the curators at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, which is a very important museum in the country and the world, that she did quite a few of exhibitions that were essentially they were essentially focused on African Americans, or they were focused on Africa. So I also had an opportunity to do, quite a few features about what they were doing. So I did as much as I could, and as much, because I still wanted to have diversity in my whole, in the programs that we did on a daily basis. But I will say that I did make a conscious effort to make sure that African Americans were included too. Right.
I'm only just realizing now. 5 or 6, a lot of shooting that you guys had to do.
Well, I mean, it absolutely was, and I would say that the photographer who I worked with, who was a co-producer, and sometimes we would flip positions because it was important for me, to learn how to, shoot pictures and edit, and I did all of that too. So I would also say that was a time when not only did I learn on the news side and the business side, but I also learned about things that were related to, producing a news story, and both, researching it, writing it, reporting it, also shooting it and editing it. And it's the kind of thing that today, people have to do everything today, but I can tell you that I was, doing it back then. So I've always kind of had an eye for the visual too, and not just the words, even though the words probably are more important to me, just because I also write.
Sure. An interesting question that has been in the interviews that I've done about stories that the newsrooms that people worked at that they didn't cover, or questions, or just kind of the question of how the newsrooms in various places kind of perceived the importance of diversity in what they covered or in their own staffing. Did anything strike you at the time that you were working in Houston related to?
Well, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind, first, it was a long time ago, and it was really in the early stages of TV when women were starting to get into the newsrooms, and also that blacks were starting to get into the newsrooms. But, for a long time, that, and especially I would say that TV was probably doing a better job only because of the fact that it was required by the FCC that they actually had to keep records of their diversity in the newsroom, in the TV stations, because, keep in mind that TV stations are licensed, and so it could very well be that if you're not making any effort at all, then someone could challenge your license. So I think that TV stations, and it's still true today, but TV stations would be very concerned about making sure that they had some diversity so their license would not be challenged. So I would think that made the news directors more aware, but at the same time that there was only so much that was going to be done. And, I was pretty young. I mean, I wasn't spending days thinking about this. It really wasn't until later that I kind of developed a consciousness about this.
The next is, let's see, sorry,
It's okay.
I kind of like to pick and choose
It's okay.
to make it fit more kind of what's going on. Did you feel that people of diverse backgrounds had kind of were treated fairly or had equal opportunities within the newsroom, or were there differences based on your race or your gender, or in terms of how you would be treated in the newsroom, or how one would be treated? Or
well, again, it's been a long time. I mean, I have now spent more time in the academy than I had in the profession, but we do need to keep in mind that today there's still a lot of work that has to be done, and it's better than the way it was, but there's still work that has to be done. And work has to be done not only in trying to hire more people of color in newsrooms, but also retaining people of color in newsrooms, and then making sure that they have the opportunities that they're in leadership positions. I mean, I think that is a lot of the problem. And the truth is that, or let me say this, I have come to believe that the admirable goals of the ASNE, American Society of Newspaper, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, that their goal was to have parity in the newsroom, and essentially making sure that the demographics in the newsroom matched the census. And so while that was a lofty goal, that goal was never achieved, and the goal never really will be achieved. And eventually they had to scale the goal back. Never were able to come close to it. And not only that, if you look at census data today, that you can see it would be extremely ambitious to try to reach that goal. We also have to keep in mind that this is not the only profession that people of color want to enter. So, from our perspective, that we would want everybody to be a journalist, but the truth is, now everything is open. I mean, you can be a rocket scientist, you can be, a physician, you can be an attorney, you can be a teacher, nurse. I mean, it's completely open. At one time, it wasn't completely open, but it is. So there's so many different fields that people can go into, and so why choose journalism? I mean, why choose a profession that is not the highest paid profession, number one, when you have choices and when you have interests, and there may be other areas where people really want you to move into that area. So the point I'm just trying to make is that it's unrealistic for us to expect that we're going to be able to have parity. So we really need to have a backup plan. And for me, the backup plan is that everyone in the newsroom, it doesn't matter what color they are, that everybody has a responsibility, and they really have to understand why diversity is important. Everyone in the newsroom needs to be knowledgeable so that they can do a better job in terms of not only including but accurate reporting, so that they can do a better job and eliminate the stereotypes. And so the bottom line for me, yes, it's important to have diversity in the newsroom. We're never going to achieve the lofty goals because there aren't enough people, and there are too many opportunities that people can have and they can take, and they will, especially higher paying opportunities. So I think that our priority really needs to be is to make sure that the news, that the way the news is covered, that it's inclusive and it's not filled with stereotypes. And that's where the work needs to be done, and I just don't think we have not achieved that goal yet. So that's my goal.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Thank you. I guess what I feel like I'm hearing is that kind of when you were working in Houston specifically, questions of diversity weren't really at the forefront of anybody's thinking particularly, but that via other means, FCC regulations or reporting kind of more broadly in the community, they were somehow touched upon, if even indirectly. Does that sound fair?
Well, because I worked in a TV newsroom, which did have, I mean, again, broadcast properties are licensed. And so, because they're licensed by a government agency, that you do have to respond to higher ups. So, I mean, you cannot, and license had been challenged. So I think that changed things. But from the perspective, that focus was just on employment. That focus was not on content, meaning that the stories that you cover, then you want to make sure there's diversity in the stories that you cover. So that was not a focus. It was just a focus on employment. And because there was a expectation that you had to have some diversity in the newsroom, then because of that expectation, that news directors hired some small number of people of color, and I was one of them. I know that I was hired. My first hire, I know I was hired because of the fact that I'm African American. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, today the experience that you're expected to have to be able to walk into a newsroom, unless you perhaps or former president's daughter, then you can go and get a job at a network without having any experience. But the truth is you have to have lots of experience today. So I guess, I'm not trying to, this is just the way it was. I'm not trying to give people a lot of credit that they were trying to do the right thing. The government, because organizations, there were advocacy organizations that were challenging licenses of broadcast, of TV stations, then that put some of the TV stations on their toes, to do something rather than to do nothing. For newspapers, I wasn't in a newspaper, but I think that newspapers didn't have very, they weren't doing a lot. Let me just say that. They probably weren't doing a lot. But when ASNE, after the 1968 Kerner Commission was released, the Kerner Commission report was released, and it was extremely critical of newspapers, news organizations for not doing a good job. And this was after the riots across the country. So it was extremely critical not only for not hiring people, people of color, but also for not telling the story of race relations in the United States. So it was extremely critical. And as a result of that, then effort was placed on trying to diversify newsrooms, and that effort has gone on for a long time, and that's when the goal for parity came about, but that goal has never been achieved, and I don't believe it will be achieved because the population has become more diverse and will continue to become more diverse, and so it's just going to be very hard to reach that. It's just not going to happen.
Were you already at Syracuse by the time that the Kerner Commission report came out, or I guess I'm going about it a roundabout way, but how is Syracuse different, or in terms of, or the same in terms of looking at questions of diversity in the newsroom and reporting and media consumption?
I mean, I don't recall when I was in graduate school, and again, that was a long time ago. I don't recall that there were discussions about that. Really, where the discussions were taking place were at AEJMC, at the annual conference, the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. And I attended my first meeting, first conference when I was in graduate school. And so that's really where I began to learn about some of these issues in a more systematic way. So it wasn't happening in the university. It wasn't, it wasn't being discussed when I was in a TV newsroom. It really happened at AEJMC. It happened in one of the divisions. It's referred to as the MAC division, which stands for the Minorities and Communications Division, and that particular division and the way the association is organized, and there are many divisions and interest groups, and also two commissions that are related to various content areas. And it could be an international division. In the case of MAC, it's the Minorities and Communications Division, that you're doing research in that particular area and you have an interest in that area. The founder of that division, Dr. Lionel Barrow, who then was the dean of Howard University in Washington, D.C., that he really single-handedly, because of his persuasive power, and this is before I had arrived, before I attended my first conference, but really, longtime members of AJMC helped them to understand how important it was, as far as diversity. Dr. Martin Luther King had been shot and killed. He had gone to school with Dr. King. The Kerner Commission report had come out. So he really was the one who raised the consciousness in AEJMC. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind, there is probably always at least one person out there who's getting things started, who's getting the conversation started, and there are a lot of different ways to get the conversation started, but it really boils down to, I believe, whether or not you are persuasive in helping people to understand why this is important. I mean, it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned, but that's not the way things necessarily were when Dr. Barrow, founded the MAC division of AJMC. And so a lot of this work really started with him, came out of there, but you can't, while I say he did it single-handedly in the sense that it was his idea that this is journalism, communication, education, and we're the ones who are training the people who are going to inherit the newsrooms, so we have a responsibility too. The responsibility is not just in the newsrooms. We have a responsibility because we are the journalism and communications programs. And so, from that, people said, yeah, that's true, and we want to be a part of that. And so it was a different time and an exciting time, I'm sure. But that's how things really started changing. And that's how AJMC really was the leading force in the changes taking place in journalism education. It was coming from AJMC, it wasn't coming from other places.
Sure, that's fascinating. Can I get you just your scarf on your right-hand side? Just kind of pull it a little bit away from the microphone.
Okay.
Make sure that,
Did it get lost under there?
Sorry, just flipping around. Stay still. Okay. That's really fascinating. Actually, I was speaking with Federico Suberbi last week.
Mm-hmm.
He said exactly the same thing, that where he was, I can't remember if he was teaching or still studying at that point.
I think he was probably still a graduate student, and he too was active in the same division, Minorities and Communications divisions, because essentially that, people of color, whether they were, and really mostly African American. I mean, we don't have as many Hispanics, Latinos, and journalism education, period. So, but he was active in that division, and so he is very much aware of the leading role that Lionel Barrow played, Lee Barrow.
Why do you think that it was coming from AEJMC and not from the universities, from elsewhere?
Well, let me say this. There's AEJMC, the Association for Education and Journalism and Mass Communication. The members of AEJMC are from universities. The vast majority of members are university professors. That some of the members are professionals who care about these issues or engage with these issues, and then they're graduate students. So this is an association that would allow you to come together and to talk about these things. So if you're discussing things from the point of view of Texas or Howard University or University of Southern California or Wisconsin or whatever, so people from various universities would come together. And in this particular division, the MAC division, the Minorities and Communications division, that was part of the agenda, the discussion. So wherever you might be from, then you were having that discussion. And so, it was logical for it to come from there. Now, Dr. Barrow, who really got this started in AJMC, he was from a university. Howard University is an HBCU, so it's predominantly black. And again, he had come from Morehouse, predominantly black in Atlanta. So, it's probably not a surprise to anyone, but from where he was the dean, and also where he'd gone to school, and the times, that it just made sense, because we're coming after the civil rights movement years. Dr. King had been assassinated, that there had been these riots across the country. The Kerner Commission report had come out extremely critical, of the news industry. And we sometimes either take it for granted or we forget that the news industry is its fundamental, its foundation is in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So that means that it's not any industry. It's different, it's unique, it's special, that it is referenced in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So there's a responsibility that you have when you're in journalism that you may not have in other fields. So it's just different. And I believe it's that sense that this industry, that this field is different, combined with the social responsibility part of journalism, and what you expect universities to do, that it probably made sense that all these people who are seeing the importance of this, having these conversations at the annual conference at AJMC, because on your own faculty at a university, you could very well be the only one. So, and then it now requires persuasion and conversations, with your colleagues. But often there are very few on your faculty who may care about these issues, other than just thinking, oh, well, that's nice, that's nice.
Can I ask how much these discussions at the AEJMC impacted your own your own research or your own studies?
Well, it absolutely did, because I'm sure, as a graduate student, you don't really know very much. You're just kind of taking it all in and just kind of amazed. I probably was amazed when I went to my first AJMC conference, which I believe was in Madison, Wisconsin, that these discussions were taking place. And it was exciting, and it certainly did impact my research, because one of my research areas, I have primarily three research areas. One of them has to do with the audience for news, and it doesn't matter whether people who are reading news through newspapers or watching television news or getting it on a smartphone, essentially the audience for news. So, and I've looked at that in a variety of ways, and you can look at it in terms of demographics and all kinds of things. So another area is diversity in news coverage. And then the third area really has to do with research methods and ethics. So the diversity in news coverage, that I became interested in that, really, I would say, as a direct result of going to my first AJMC conference, because of the fact that after that conference, while I had been interested in just the audience for news, I added another area of research. I started looking at diversity in news coverage, and I still look at diversity in news coverage today. I also created a course some years ago that is called African Americans in the Media, and the focus is on diversity in news coverage. And that particular course, I think, is even more important today than it was when I first created it. So the bottom line is AJMC, perhaps more than anything else, has had an impact on my research, has had an impact on my teaching, and it's, you know, had an impact on my worldview when it comes to, you know, the importance of diversity, certainly in journalism.
You're anticipating all of my questions.
Can we talk a little bit more just about the teaching? The question here is, to what extent has your teaching involved diversity, and has AJMC played a role in that?
Yeah, well, first thing, the way this association is organized, that it's organized around 3 areas. And so one is research, the second is teaching, and the third is called PF&R, Professional Freedom and Responsibility. And so that's the social responsibility component. So the research part at AJMC, that people do research, they submit a research conference paper by the April 1 deadline. You know, they're notified about this about now in mid-May, and then if their paper is accepted, they present it at the August conference. The annual conference is always held in August. The teaching component is there are lots of various initiatives and discussions about teaching and making, you know, about the curriculum, how we teach, and bringing in diversity, et cetera, bringing in all kinds of things. And, you know, diversity is probably defined very broadly. You know, the course I teach here is focused on African Americans in the media, but we also have courses here about gender and news and media, because everything that I could say about the poor coverage when it comes to race and ethnicity in news, that similar things could be said about how women are covered. So there is variety there. But, you know, AJMC teaching is very important, and, you know, every year at the annual conference that there are probably as many panels and discussions about being more effective teachers, or, you know, how can we improve the curriculum, and so forth. And from time to time it is about diversity, but it's not, I mean, there are a lot of issues related to teaching. You know, from my perspective, diversity is perhaps one of the most important that we still need to be talking about.
Sure. Are there specific words here, challenges or triumphs that you encountered while looking into questions of diversity in the academy, in any regards? I suppose in maybe a way to reduce the scope of the question, in teaching or in advocating for diversity in the academy, do any challenges or triumphs kind of come to mind for you from your experience?
Well, the thing is, there's an urgency that is not felt by many. And, you know, you have to keep in mind that the accreditation of universities, of journalism communication programs, and that's separate from AJMC. That is not AJMC. But if you want to be in an accredited program, there are certain things that you have to do to be an accredited program. And one of them has to do with that you have to have a diversity plan, and that diversity plan means what it is that you are trying to do in terms of increasing diversity, you know, in your faculty, what you're doing as far as increasing diversity in your curriculum, in your teaching, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to be in an accredited program, you have to do that. You can't just be an accredited program and ignore that. And there are other things that you have to do. That's just one of the standards that that is required. Every 6 years that you go up for reaccreditation, so then you have to be evaluated on how well you're doing. And many universities around the country are having trouble with diversity, certainly trying to diversify their faculties, because the truth is, the same way as far as newsrooms, that there's so many areas that people can go into, and they're not necessarily going to be trying for journalism, going into journalism. The same thing, there's so many areas that you could get a PhD. If you wanted to be a university professor, there's so many things that you could be doing, so many areas you could go in. It's not necessarily journalism. And the same thing, you may very well choose that you'd rather be in the newsroom as opposed to being in the university. So there are a lot of different things, and it's very challenging. It's very hard to diversify the faculty beyond just a few. So it is a challenge. So that's one of the biggest challenges, and we're no different from any other university. But even the universities that are challenged and are not doing a very good job when it comes to diversifying their faculty, some of them are committed to having an impact where they can have an impact. There are some places you can have an impact, regardless. You can still have an impact on your curriculum. You can have a very diverse curriculum. You can make sure that you are integrating diversity throughout the curriculum, which is the ideal, as opposed to having these separate, isolated, segregated courses. So the ideal is to integrate it throughout. To even do that, it does require, I believe, that you probably need to do some workshops to bring people up to date to know how to do that and how they can incorporate it. So the bottom line is, if you want to be in an accredited program, there are things you have to do. And some things are hard, and some things are easier. Diversifying your curriculum is easier than some of the other things. And making sure you may not have success in your hiring, but there are things that you can do with your hiring, and making sure that you look as widely as possible, to try to diversify for as much as you possibly can the search process when you're hiring. So there are things you can do. And we can certainly do a much better job here at the University of Texas at Austin, no question about that. And there are other universities that can do a better job. But I think it really boils down to the commitment. Are you committed? And every university is not committed. I mean, every university does not see the benefit, the value. For a long time, when some news organizations were trying, and certainly the ASNA, trying to diversify, have more diversity, they would say, and Gannett particularly would say, this is good business. Well, I say that this is a social responsibility. And it comes back to the issue that I was talking about earlier, talking about the fact that, the press is in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So there is a reason for that. There's a social responsibility reason for that. And I think if universities recognize that social responsibility, then they may get it, why this is important, because we're also training future journalists, preparing future journalists. And if we don't do anything about diversity, helping them to understand, and it gets harder and harder, because this generation that we're teaching right now is the millennial generation. Before we know it, it's going to be the post-millennial generation, and they are farther and farther and farther away from the civil rights movement, or the period of time that really inspired somebody like Dr. Lee Barrell to really want to bring about a change, and he was able to get other colleagues at AJMC, to join his movement. But this generation is so far away from that, and they have no idea, unless they learned it in the history book, probably didn't, that things, the way they are today, they have not always been this way. So, the bottom line is that we have a lot of work to do, and AJMC needs to continue to, help people, help universities, help individual faculty members continue to support. And AJMC is probably one of the most supportive organizations in the country, on the planet, when it comes to diversity, no question about that. And so we just have to continue to support and help, and the accreditation people need to continue to take seriously that the diversity standard is something that has to be taken very seriously, and hold universities to account if they don't do a good job in the areas that they can do a good job. I don't remember what your question was. I'm sorry.
You're really just knocking out these questions faster than I can go through them.
One of the kind of the feeling that I've gotten from talking to the number of people that I have is that at least the people that I've spoken with so far seem to feel that the emphasis that was being put on diversity in the newsroom, in the academy, has lessened in the past. I don't know how long, 10 years, 5 years, but from where it once was. I guess so. The question is kind of, have you seen that to be the case, or do you feel that's the case? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, it is the case, but part of the reason is that
just to repeat what it.
So your question is whether or not there's less emphasis today on diversity in newsrooms. Yes. I mean, no question that's the case, but it's also a little understandable in the sense that news organizations have been trying to survive. Newspapers in particular were extremely profitable, and for a long time, I would say newspapers resisted. They were slow to change because they probably thought the internet was going to go away, or they just couldn't believe that people would be reading the news on these, smartphones or tablet computers and so forth. And they, instead of getting ahead of the issue, they were behind and then got caught. Advertising went away. Classified advertising went to Craigslist. What made it even worse that we had a recession, 2008. And so all of the very profitable newspapers that we knew that existed, that just went away. And, not being able to find a replacement, still trying to figure out how to make it work. So the newspaper industry in particular was in really bad shape. Because again, as I said before, it's a business. This is a business. I mean, if you want to be successful, you have to be successful with your news, but you also have to be successful with the business side. Selling the advertising, the classified advertising, the display advertising, and certainly for newspapers, there's subscriptions and so forth. So it's a business. You have to be successful with that. And if you're spending all of your time trying to figure out how to not go under, then it's hard to think about all of these other things which sound nice and they're good and they're socially responsible, but still it's a business. So I think that has had a lot to do with it. I also think that there's been so you downsize, then you expect people to be able to do more. Journalists to do more. So not only are you, reporting the story, researching the story, writing the story, you're also having to shoot, video perhaps. You're having to shoot pictures. So now you're having to do a whole lot more that you never had to do. So you're doing more with less, and it's been a real challenge. And I would say in the past year or so, past few years, first time that we haven't, every other news article is not about that the news industry is dying. So the bleeding has stopped, and then the question becomes, where do we go from here? But in the meantime, it hasn't changed the fact that you still need to make diversity a priority. And it's not a priority, but I understand why it hasn't been. So I think now is the time that we need to get back to that. You know, things are stabilized. So we need to get back to reminding ourselves that this is more important than ever. And so that's kind of where we are. And I would say the same thing for, journalism and communication schools, because of the fact that many journalism and communication schools, because they work very closely, with the news organizations in their communities, and, when their students are not being hired because they can't hire anybody, they're laying people off, and it was really a very scary time. But okay, things are stabilized, so we need to just get back to the business, of making sure that we have as diverse a newsroom as we possibly can, but more importantly, that we have better coverage in terms of being more inclusive and not stereotyping various groups. And to me, that's a major part of the problem.
I should be reading these while you're answering, but some of the time someone gives you an answer and you can kind of like go along and prepare. But so with you, I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. Okay, I think we've gone through the majority. I just want to make sure out of these AJMC focus questions that we know them all. Can I ask about your involvement in AJMC?
Mm-hmm.
You said your first conference was
when I was in graduate school.
When you were in graduate school?
Well, don't quote me. When I say it was Madison, I think it was Madison. But so don't quote me on where it was. I would really have to look it up. But I will say that I first became a member of AJMC when I was in graduate school, and it is an expectation. So if you are in a PhD program or think you're going to go in the PhD, and actually I was in my master's program, but I had already started thinking about getting a PhD. And so it is the case that you're going to becoming a member of AJMC so that you can present, do research, you can present your research, and you can get feedback on your research. So that is the expectation. I mean, that's what distinguishes a graduate program that is more oriented toward research and teaching at a university. And so I started doing that when I was in graduate school. When I started the PhD program, that I received one of it was called then a doctoral minority scholarship, but now the name, since Dr. Barrow has died, that the scholarship was renamed after him. And this particular scholarship was part of what he did to encourage or to help increase minority students, PhD students in journalism and communications. So many of the members of AJMC, I don't know how many, but some of them gave toward this scholarship. And so while I was in graduate school, I was the recipient. I was very proud to receive that. So as a doctoral student, I received one of these scholarships, and it certainly helped me. But it also said that these people are serious about increasing minority faculty, because to get minority faculty, basically you need to establish a pipeline where there are more minorities who are going to graduate school in PhD programs, that they are learning about doing research and they're presenting research and so forth. And so that particular scholarship, in fact, that's one of the reasons I brought the program, because it's always listed in there, everyone across the country who receives it. And if you were to look across the country at the various racial and ethnic groups around the country who are teaching at various universities, then many of them were probably recipients at some time of this particular scholarship. So it certainly made a difference. So I started in AJMC in graduate school, received one of these very prestigious, it is a very prestigious scholarship for minority doctoral students. And, I presented research papers, and in fact, one of the first, it wasn't the first one, but maybe it was the second one, when I was inspired about doing research when it comes to race and ethnicity, that a colleague of mine, a fellow graduate student, and I did what's called a review of the literature, and we looked at all the studies that had been published on blacks in television and newspapers, etc. And so we kind of brought all that literature together so it would be in one place, and then we presented a paper on that. Essentially it was a literature review, meta-analysis as some would call it, and from that we published an article in Journal Broadcasting. So my involvement with AJMC, that not only was I recipient of this important minority doctoral scholarship, that I became active in the MAC division. In fact, that very first year that I ran for office, they said, okay, well, you run for this office, and I did, and so I was elected to my first office there, and I was presenting research, and so I was doing all of the things that you would do if you're going to end up with an academic career, and AJMC really supported me in that. And I stayed active with AJMC really until I went to the Los Angeles Times. So after being there for a couple of years, it just seemed less relevant to me. And, because now I'm in the industry, it didn't seem as relevant, and it is very academic. So then I lapsed, my membership lapsed for a while. But when I returned to the university to teach here, then I got involved with AJMC again. So all the things that I was talking about that I was doing before, that I've become even more involved and active. I became very involved with the MAC division. And the way it often happens, that there are all of these divisions, there are about 30 to 40 divisions, interest groups, and commissions. And that you are not only a member of AJMC, you are a member of that. You can select whichever ones you want to be a member of that particular group. And I'm a member of many groups, but the one that I'm active with is the MAC division. So this is the same division that Dr. Barrow had founded. And through this division that I eventually was elected, I think first vice head and then head. So my leadership really kind of came through that. And then from there, later I was elected, and this was across the whole membership. I was elected to what's called the Standing Committee on Research. There's several standing committees. One is research, one is teaching, and one, as I said before, PF&R, which is professional freedom and responsibility. And when you were elected to that, I served 2 3-year terms. And that particular committee has responsibility for a lot of the awards that are given across the division. When I chaired that committee, that I had the opportunity to start a new award, a book award called the Tankard Book Award. It was an idea, it was named after our colleague from here who died, Jim Tankard. And from that, I proposed it because when you are chair of that committee, you also serve on the board of directors. So I served on the board of directors. I proposed this idea, and this idea was accepted. And I think we're going into about the 7th or 8th year of the Tankard Book Award, but it's become one of the most prestigious awards that AJMC gives, and it's to book authors because most of the stuff that we do is really conference papers, and so that was wonderful. And then I finished out my 2 terms and was working on some other things, and then one day I was nominated for a new award that was named after Lee Barrell. So this is a a new award, and I would need to look up to give you the exact name, but this is a new award, but essentially recognizing your contributions in research and teaching and leadership. And so the very first year for this new Lionel Barrow Award that I received it, and it was really quite an honor because, again, it recognized me in the areas that were important to him. And then after a few years later, I received a call from the Nominations and Elections Committee chair saying that they wanted me to run for vice president of AJMC. You know, these national elections that we have, they run 2 people for vice president. If you're elected vice president, then you move up. And so, because I was trying to finish up a book, my first response was, no, I don't have time. But then I said that would be stupid not to run. So I did, and I won. So I have been essentially in the leadership for AJMC, you know, first elected, well, vice president-elect, then vice president, then president-elect. And this year is my year, 2013, 2014, to be president. I will preside over our conference, which will be held in Montreal. And as president of AJMC, and every president has his or her own initiatives, and I really started with my initiatives before I actually was installed as president, but you know, several initiatives, things that we've never done before, which I've been, you know, very excited about. And I most recently, you know, decided, you know, as president, you write a column for the newsletter. And so the column that I'm getting ready to write for the July newsletter is going to be on diversity, so that I can remind people that it still matters and there's still work that needs to be done. But one of the things as president of AJMC that you know, have the opportunity to make a difference in a lot of different ways. And you know, another way making a difference, and the centennial, we just celebrated 100 years of AJMC, so we're now 102, we're 102 years old. And we had a centennial campaign of $300,000. And we successfully exceeded our $300,000. And one of the things in the monies that we raised, we specifically said that some of it would go to diversity programming, and you know, which was very important. And so I had an opportunity, being on the board and the executive group, to decide how exactly that we were going to spend that money on diversity, and not all of it, but some of it. And so that was good. So you can have an impact, and I believe that I've had an opportunity to have a positive impact on diversity. And I also believe that by being president of AJMC as an African American, I'm not the first African American. We've had 2 previously African American women, and then prior to that, 1 African American man. But what it says is that we truly, you know, we really walk the talk. We don't just say that diversity is important, that we actually do that. And I think that's a very important message for us to send. And I feel like I've been able to send that message.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of wrapping up, because you really have nailed out all these questions. Having been a member of AJMC since you were a graduate student, are there any, I guess, more macro scale changes that you've witnessed throughout your tenure as a member, in terms of the organization in general, or the MAC committee, or just the organization's relationship to diversity, questions of diversity in journalism?
Well, I just attended the Unity Diversity Caucus in Washington, D.C., representing AJMC. And Unity initially was comprised of all of the minority journalism associations, and 2 of them have dropped out. But still, they invited everybody, other associations involved with journalism and journalism education, so everybody came, and it was a really big deal. At this particular association, at this caucus, they asked, because they wanted to talk about where do we go from here, because there was a recognition. So I'm not the only one recognizing there's work that needs to be done. So we were talking about that in March in Washington, D.C. And they had asked each of us to talk about how our organizations that we were representing had had an impact, on diversity and vice versa, and what else needs to be done. So in my initial comments, I said for AJMC, I said that diversity is in our DNA. It is who we are. So when you say AJMC, you are talking about diversity. If you look at the bylaws, it is in the bylaws. If you look at how the organization makes sure that all of the programming and the panels and even the slate of officers, that's the slate that's run, for the leadership, that there is a concerted effort to make sure that there is diversity in each and every way. So that's really who we are. I mean, we don't always succeed as much as we'd like to, because again, you'd like to have all of these different divisions to be very diverse, but there are only going to be so many members of AJMC who might represent various racial and ethnic groups. So I mean, it's better, but you can't make people appear if they're not in the pipeline to appear. So the bottom line is we're at a very good place that Dr. Barrow really got us here. He started us here. It's infused throughout the organization. Not only that, we have these awards to recognize. So not only is there an award to recognize an individual that it can have an impact on diversity, there's another award that was started which recognizes universities, that those universities, it's called an Equity and Diversity Award, that those universities are making concrete progress in areas, everything from hiring, to the curriculum and teaching and research, etc. So, I mean, that's coming from AJMC. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can say. And so when I started as a graduate student, we probably mostly had the MAC division. So we didn't have all of these other ways to recognize and to let everybody know that, yes, diversity is important. We reward diversity, and we expect for you to be concerned about diversity too. So I would say that that's where we are today, and that's a good thing. And the real question is, where do we go from here? One of the things that we're doing, and the president-elect who will become president next year, that she will be restarting a mentorship program to get more diverse administrators. So essentially those who are on faculties, you have various universities, who would like to be deans and department heads and so forth, then AJMC funded a program really for about 7 or 8 years. I would need to check to know exactly how long. But then because it was no longer able to get foundation support and it wasn't able to support itself, then the program has been on hiatus. But as a result of the Centennial Campaign, which I just mentioned, that we're able to restart this program, and this program will have an impact on having more diverse administrators. So AJMC, I would say, is still working hard to do as much as it can to stay ahead and really be a leader as far as diversity. But there's still work to be done. But at least I would say that we are ahead of many others.
Okay. I can't remember if it was Dr. Suberti or Ray Chavez who I was speaking to who mentioned that program in particular, and was.
I think it was probably Federico Suburbi because he went through the program. Okay. It was called J-Led at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was saying that that's the thing that AJMC should do to kind of promote diversity.
So it seems like you guys are all.
Well,
it seems like he hasn't heard about it. You guys are ahead of.
Well, he actually went through the program.
No, I mean restarting it.
Oh, well, you know what? We just found the money, so that money that we raised from the Centennial campaign, that we're going to put toward that, and then the Association of Administrators. But no, this is something that is breaking news that he hasn't heard about, because we've just been working on it. But it will make a difference. I mean, it was kind of sad that the foundation stopped supporting it, because I don't know why, but we are able to support it, and we hope that we'll be able to support it, long term as opposed to short term.